The message arrived at exactly 6:17 on a Tuesday morning while I was still half asleep and getting ready for work, and at first glance it looked like nothing more than a harmless question from an elderly relative, a simple sentence asking, "Do you still remember how to feed sparrows during winter?" Yet the moment I read it, something inside me tightened in a way I could not ignore, because that question was not random. It was a code, one I had not seen in more than 20 years, a private system my grandmother and I created when I was a child to communicate danger without ever speaking it directly. And the meaning behind it was always the same: I am not safe, I cannot say more, I need you to come. And that realization alone was enough to make my entire morning collapse into something far more urgent than work or routine. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because what follows is exactly the kind of situation where silence becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. My name is Clara Bennett. I am 33 years old, and I work as a private investigator specializing in financial fraud, a profession that taught me how quickly families can shift from normal to controlled environments without anyone noticing, especially when the person being controlled is elderly and everyone else benefits from pretending nothing is wrong. And in my case, that contradiction had defined my entire relationship with my family for more than a decade, because according to my father, Richard I was the one who misunderstood everything, the one who saw conspiracies where there were only decisions, the one who refused to accept that things were ever as simple as they looked, while in reality I had built a career out of identifying exactly those moments when something that looked simple was actually structured deception. My grandmother Eleanor, however, had always been the exception, the only person who never treated my instincts like a flaw, and the only reason that message felt so alarming was because she would never have used that code unless she had exhausted every other option available to her. I tried calling her immediately, but there was no answer. Then I tried again during my drive, then again an hour later, and each time the silence felt less like coincidence and more like interference, especially when I remembered that over the past year my access to her had become increasingly filtered through other people, usually my father or my brother, who would answer first and explain that she was resting, or tired, or unavailable, explanations that sounded reasonable in isolation but became suspicious when repeated with mechanical consistency over time. And by the time I arrived at her house that afternoon without warning anyone, I already had the uncomfortable feeling that I was not the only one trying to reach her. The first real obstacle appeared before I even stepped inside, because my father was leaving just as I arrived, and the moment he saw me his expression shifted into something carefully controlled, a mix of surprise and calculation, as if my presence was an unexpected variable in a plan he had already finalized. And before I could even ask anything, he began speaking about my grandmother's condition, insisting she had become confused, insisting her memory was unstable, insisting that I should keep the visit short, all delivered with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone repeating a rehearsed narrative. When I finally entered the house, I found my grandmother sitting by the window, calm, alert, and far more present than the description I had just been given, because she recognized me instantly, asked about my work, referenced recent events with accuracy, and followed conversation with a clarity that did not match the story of rapid cognitive decline I had been told to expect, and within minutes I understood the first contradiction. She was not lost in confusion. She was being described that way. The moment I mentioned the sparrows, everything changed for half a second. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just a subtle shift in her expression that I would have missed if I had not been watching closely, a flicker of relief, like someone confirming that a signal had finally reached its destination. But before she could respond properly, a caregiver entered the room with medication, and the atmosphere tightened immediately. The conversation ended, and my grandmother fell silent in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. That moment stayed with me longer than anything else that day, especially after I noticed the medication bottles nearby, because while I am not a doctor, I have seen enough financial and elder abuse cases to recognize how often control begins not with money but with influence over routine care, over prescriptions, over access to communication. And the more I looked at what was happening, the more the situation began to resemble cases where a vulnerable person is gradually isolated under their justification of protection, until their own voice becomes secondary to the narrative built around them. That night I researched every medication I had seen, cross-checked interactions, side effects, and long-term impacts, and while nothing proved intent on its own, several of them could absolutely produce the kind of confusion my father repeatedly described to anyone who asked about her condition, which raised a question I could not easily dismiss, whether the symptoms were being managed or being maintained. Over the following days I attempted to return, but each visit was blocked by a different explanation. She was resting, she had an appointment, she was not feeling well, and each answer came faster than the last, as if prepared in advance, until it became obvious that I was no longer dealing with chance scheduling conflicts but with controlled access. And then something else shifted, because one of her long-term caregivers suddenly disappeared without notice. No resignation, no explanation, no forwarding contact, just gone. And when I asked about her, I received 3 different stories from 3 different relatives, none of which matched, which told me more than the answers themselves ever could. The real turning point came when I managed to visit again while my father was away, and my grandmother, instead of speaking freely, appeared visibly tense, constantly checking the hallway as if expecting interruption, until she finally reached for my hand, pressed a folded piece of paper into it, and leaned back as if nothing had happened, and I did not open it until I reached my car, because I already knew that whatever was written there would change everything. And when I finally unfolded it, there were no explanations, no names, no context, only 3 words written in trembling handwriting that immediately turned every doubt into something far more concrete, because it said, "I didn't sign." The moment I read those 3 words, "I didn't sign," everything that had felt fragmented suddenly started aligning into something far more structured and far more dangerous. Because in my line of work I had seen enough financial manipulation cases to know that when an elderly person denies a signature, it is never just about one document. It usually means a chain of documents, a chain of decisions, and a chain of people who all benefit from pretending that consent exists where it does not. And as I sat in my car holding that note, I realized that my grandmother was not simply asking for help. She was confirming that something legal had already been done in her name without her agreement, which meant the situation had moved far beyond suspicion and into active fraud territory. I drove home that night without turning on the radio, replaying every interaction I had observed over the past year, every delayed phone call, every carefully filtered conversation, every moment where someone else had spoken for her before she could speak for herself, and what once looked like family concern now resembled something much more deliberate, a system designed to control access, control perception, and control information flow around a single person whose signature carried financial weight. The next morning I stopped thinking like a granddaughter and fully shifted into investigator mode, because emotional reaction would only slow me down, and the first thing I did was reconstruct a timeline of my grandmother's financial and medical situation using public records, property registries, and corporate filings. And within hours I started noticing inconsistencies that were too precise to ignore, because several minor transactions tied to her accounts had begun shifting months earlier. Small at first, almost invisible, then gradually increasing in complexity, involving trusts, intermediaries, and restructuring agreements that would have been extremely unusual for someone of her age and supposed cognitive condition. At the same time, the official narrative presented by my father Richard remained consistent in public spaces. She is confused, she is declining, she needs protection, and that contradiction between legal activity and medical narrative was exactly the kind of pattern I had been trained to identify, because it usually signals one of 2 things, either negligence or exploitation, and the second option always leaves a trail if you know where to look. What made the situation worse was how quickly the social environment around my grandmother began reacting to my curiosity, because within a short period of time I started receiving indirect calls from relatives I rarely spoke to, all asking similar questions in slightly different tones. Why are you looking into grandma's finances? Are you worried about something? Do you really think there's a problem? Questions that felt coordinated rather than spontaneous, especially because I had not shared my concerns with anyone outside a very small professional circle. which meant someone inside the family was already circulating information about my investigation in real time. That alone told me that my father was no longer just managing my grandmother's situation, he was managing perception around it, and that required coordination, messaging, and influence, not just authority. 2 days later, I managed to reach Teresa, one of my grandmother's oldest friends, a woman who had known her for decades and who had quietly stopped visiting over the past year without explanation. And when I finally convinced her to talk, her hesitation told me more than her words at first, because she kept lowering her voice, looking around, and choosing her sentences carefully, as if she was afraid of being overheard even during a private phone call. What she eventually revealed confirmed my suspicions in a way that made the situation significantly more serious, because according to her, my grandmother had mentioned multiple times that she was being asked to sign documents she did not fully understand, documents related to property management, financial restructuring, and legal authorization, and whenever she refused or asked for time to review them properly, the pressure increased indirectly through medical explanations, administrative urgency, and reassurances that everything was for her own protection. That conversation pushed me to contact my grandmother's former legal advisor, a retired attorney who had handled parts of her estate for years, and while he initially refused to speak in detail, the moment I mentioned the phrase "I didn't sign," his tone changed, because he immediately understood what I was implying, and after a long pause he admitted that certain recent filings had bypassed the usual verification process, being presented through accelerated legal channels under claims of urgency and cognitive limitation, which significantly reduced the scrutiny typically required for high-value estate modifications. He did not accuse anyone directly, but what he did say was enough to confirm that multiple documents had been processed in a way that would normally require clear, independent confirmation of consent, something that now seemed questionable given my grandmother's current situation. From there, the financial picture began to shift rapidly, because I started tracing asset movements that did not match the public narrative, properties that had been partially transferred, accounts that had been restructured, and funds that had been redistributed through layered entities designed to obscure direct ownership. And the more I followed the trail, the clearer it became that this was not a single event but an ongoing process, a gradual extraction of value disguised as administrative management. What stood out most was the consistency of the authorization pattern, because despite the complexity of the transactions, the approvals repeatedly pointed back to the same internal source, documents marked as signed by my grandmother, documents that were then used to justify further financial changes, creating a feedback loop where each supposed signature enabled the next operation. The pressure on me increased almost immediately once those findings started surfacing, because my brother showed up unexpectedly at my apartment one evening, something that almost never happened, and instead of asking questions he immediately tried to redirect me, insisting that I was overreacting, that I was misinterpreting standard estate management, that I was putting unnecessary stress on the family, and then he made a mistake, because in trying to sound informed he referenced a specific trust restructuring document that I had not mentioned to him, and the moment he said it I understood that he was not outside this situation, he was inside it, even if only partially aware of how far it had gone. After that conversation I stopped assuming ignorance and started assuming involvement, which changed the entire direction of my investigation, because now I was not just looking for evidence of fraud, I was mapping participation, and the deeper I looked the clearer it became that my grandmother's isolation was not accidental, it was functional. It created the conditions necessary for decisions to be made without her direct influence, and every layer of medical explanation, family reassurance, and administrative urgency was reinforcing that structure. By the end of that week I had enough information to request an independent review through a legal advocate specializing in elder financial protection, and once the process was initiated, everything inside the family began to destabilize at once, because the moment outside scrutiny entered the system, control over the narrative started to break down, and what had been presented as concern for an elderly woman began to look increasingly like coordinated financial exploitation built on manufactured incapacity and disputed consent. By the time the independent review officially began, the situation inside my family had already shifted from quiet control to open resistance, because what had once been a carefully managed narrative around my grandmother's condition was now being examined by outside professionals who were not influenced by family reputation, emotional pressure, or internal authority. And that alone was enough to create tension across every relationship connected to her estate, as if the entire structure that had held for months was suddenly exposed to light and beginning to fracture in real time, and I could feel that shift not through dramatic confrontation, but through small changes in behavior, unanswered calls, delayed responses, and carefully worded messages that no longer tried to convince me I was wrong, but instead tried to slow me down. The first official findings arrived faster than expected, and they immediately confirmed one of the most important suspicions I had built the case around, because the medical evaluation conducted by an independent specialist concluded that my grandmother retained significantly more cognitive capacity than had been publicly described over the past year. And while she was certainly an elderly woman with natural limitations, there was no evidence supporting the level of confusion that had been repeatedly used as justification for restricted access, supervised communication, and substituted decision-making, which meant that at least part of the narrative surrounding her condition had been exaggerated and possibly used as a foundation for decisions made on her behalf. At the same time, the financial review uncovered inconsistencies in several recent transactions, not necessarily illegal on their surface when viewed individually, but highly questionable when considered as a pattern, because they showed repeated authorization of complex asset movements that would normally require clear and informed consent, especially given her age and documented medical profile. When those preliminary reports became known within the family network, the reaction was immediate and divided, because my father Richard attempted to frame the investigation as an external misunderstanding, insisting that my grandmother's condition fluctuated and that the reports failed to capture her most difficult periods, while simultaneously questioning the credibility of the evaluators themselves. A strategy one had seen before in other fraud cases where the goal is not to disprove evidence directly, but to undermine the authority of those presenting it, yet this time it was less effective, because the review was not based on opinion, it was based on documented observation, verified records, and repeated assessments conducted under controlled conditions. As the process continued, more financial layers began to surface, including structured transfers that had been divided into smaller transactions to avoid triggering immediate scrutiny thresholds, and the use of intermediary accounts that made it difficult to trace the full flow of funds without formal authorization requests, which in itself did not prove criminal intent, but strongly indicated deliberate planning. Because such structures are rarely created spontaneously, they require coordination, legal guidance, and a clear understanding of how oversight mechanisms operate. What made it more concerning was the timing, because many of these changes began shortly after my grandmother's access to external communication had been increasingly limited, creating a parallel between isolation and financial restructuring that was difficult to ignore. During this period, my relationship with my brother deteriorated completely, because instead of avoiding the subject, he began actively confronting me, first by insisting I was damaging the family reputation, then by suggesting I was misinterpreting standard estate management procedures, and finally by implying that I was motivated by personal resentment rather than concern. But what he did not realize was that every attempt to pressure me only reinforced my conclusions, because in investigative work, emotional escalation often appears when documentation becomes threatening, and the more he tried to push me away from the case, the clearer it became that there was something worth protecting from scrutiny. The turning point came when the legal advocate formally requested a suspension of certain financial powers pending full verification of authorization history, a step that immediately triggered significant pushback from within the family structure, because once that request was filed, ongoing transactions were frozen for review, and previously approved movements were placed under retrospective examination, effectively forcing transparency into a system that had previously operated with limited external visibility. Within days, several advisors who had been involved in the administrative side of my grandmother's affairs began distancing themselves, some claiming procedural confusion, others citing compliance concerns, and a few simply withdrawing without explanation, which in itself suggested that the structure supporting these decisions was not as stable as it had appeared. At the same time, I began spending more time with my grandmother in a controlled, documented environment approved by the review process, and what I observed during those visits further reinforced the gap between her actual condition and the narrative that had been constructed around her, because she was aware, communicative, and capable of expressing clear preferences about her daily life, even if she occasionally forgot minor details, and more importantly, she consistently repeated one central concern: that she had been asked to sign documents she did not fully understand, and that when she hesitated or requested clarification, she was reassured that everything had already been decided for her benefit. Hearing that directly from her, in her own words, removed any remaining ambiguity about the core issue of consent. The consequences of the investigation began to expand beyond the immediate family when external auditors identified irregularities significant enough to warrant formal reporting, and at that point the situation transitioned from a private dispute into a structured legal process, meaning that every claim, every signature, and every transaction now required validation against independent records, and as that process unfolded, inconsistencies became harder to contain. Some documents could not be fully verified, some approvals lacked supporting authorization history, and some financial movements could not be clearly reconciled with my grandmother's express intent as recorded during independent interviews. My father's public position began to weaken gradually, not through a single dramatic collapse, but through accumulation, because the more the records were examined, the more the narrative required increasingly complex explanations, and at a certain point complexity itself becomes a liability, especially when simpler explanations exist that align more closely with documented behavior. Internally, the family structure that had once relied on his authority started to fragment, because people who had previously accepted his version of events without question began to realize that accepting a narrative and proving it are two very different things. In the final stages of the review, several key documents were formally challenged, including authorizations that had been used to justify major financial restructuring, and while the legal outcome took time to finalize, the immediate effect was the partial reversal of control over certain assets, pending full adjudication, which significantly altered the balance of power surrounding my grandmother's estate. More importantly, it restored something that had been steadily eroding over the previous year: her ability to participate directly in decisions affecting her life, without interpretation, without substitution, and without filtering through others. The last time I saw my father in any meaningful capacity during the process was at a procedural meeting related to final documentation, and there was no dramatic confrontation, no emotional outburst, no public scene, only a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond his control, and for the first time I saw him without the confidence he had always projected, not defeated in a theatrical sense, but constrained by evidence that no longer responded to influence or reputation. There was nothing satisfying or triumphant about it, only clarity. A few weeks later, when I visited my grandmother again, the environment had changed noticeably, not because everything was resolved, but because the uncertainty had been replaced with structure, and she was no longer isolated within decisions that affected her life. And as we sat together in her living room, she told me something simple that stayed with me more than any legal outcome. She said she had started to feel like herself again, not because everything that happened had been undone, but because she was finally being included in the decisions that defined her own existence. And in that moment I understood that the real outcome of the entire investigation was not financial correction or family consequence, but the restoration of something far more fragile and far more valuable: the right to be fully present in your own life, even when others believe they know better than you.